Good morning again. Rebonjour. So we'll start our next session. I'm honored to be the moderator for the next discussion panel. And we have three individuals with their individual expertise. We got Marc Tasse at my far left, Bill Marquardt, and Douglas Small. And the topic of this discussion dovetails with what we talked about earlier this morning in terms of, the bad actors, the individuals themselves, what motivates them within an enterprise, within a business culture to get involved in corruption, to pay the bribe, what motivates them. And I think it's really important for us to understand that, because this is how we're going to be able to have the policies, identify the red flags that facilitates these people, these bad actors that put themselves at risk, put the company at risk because of greed or whatever other motivation comes into mind. So I'll let our three panelists introduce themselves, and then we can start with the questions.
Great,
gentlemen?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
My name's Doug Small. I'm a director at Berkeley Research Group, an expert services firm in the U.S. I've been doing corruption-type investigations for roughly 25 years. I was an FBI agent for 15 years, working corporate fraud, money laundering, et cetera. For the last 10 years, I've been in the consulting realm, again, assisting clients with FCPA and other sorts of corporate investigations and fraud.
Good morning. My name is Bill Marquardt. I'm also with Berkeley Research Group. I'm a director/partner with the company. Unfortunately for all of you, I'm the forensic accountant in the room, so I apologize up front for that. I started out in public accounting. I've spent about 25 years in the field as well, about half the time on the side of the desk where I'm trying to sell you something, and the other side on the other side of the desk where I'm trying to actually buy something and make sure I get value for money. So if I sound schizophrenic, it's because I am. Do a lot of work with the SEC and DOJ, in particular with financial statement restatements, FCPA, corruption, internal investigations, background work. I primarily work out of Miami and work in the Latin American region. So my bad Spanish is better than my non-existent French.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Marc Tasse. I'm with the Canadian Center of Excellence for Anti-Corruption. I've been working as a forensic accountant, but in French, for about the last 20, 25 years also. I had a chance to get work on a lot of different cases, mostly representing clients. It's been fun. I saw an evolution over the time, and I think that today we'll be able to discuss about that evolution, trying to understand why do people actually commit crimes, and then how do they justify it. So that's about it.
Thank you, gentlemen. In the previous panel, we all talked about the individual bad actors and the corporate culture. And I think it's important to put this in context where people that are providing bribes, when they know it is illegal, rationalize their action. They rationalize the fact that, we need to do this, it's just the way we do business, or other factors. Could you expand on this to how and why, where they find this rationalization to do something that is illegal or unethical?
Well, on my side, very often I think it's a way of thinking. Some of them think that they deserve to be recognized. They think that they will just diffuse the harm that they feel. They have all kind of rationalization, which doesn't stand strong, to be honest with you, but they feel that they have a reason to do it, and the reason is very logic for them. But what we also found out, that some were doing it out of greed for money or greed for attention. But what we see now is mostly they were actually driven by performance anxiety. They were always seen as being the best one in the company, the one who were able to take care of business, the one that people would look up to. And then they had that pressure to always perform and perform. And for some of them, they just weren't able to perform anymore in a legal way. So they had to justify bending laws over. One thing that we also noticed was the fact that they are what I sometimes call the chief loophole officers. They find loopholes. They say, well, you know what? I think that if I was to do it this way, would probably be okay. So the rationalization process is to say, well, they made a law, but hey, there is loopholes, so I'm taking advantage of it, unfortunately.
The letter of the law versus the intent. Yeah.
Exactly.
And you never forget, these are some of the smarter people because they figured out your internal control systems and now have the ability to work around, through, over, under. So they're not the underperformers, which is something we need to make very clear out the front. These are your best people, or some of your best people, and often some of your smartest people. Another aspect of it absent, a personal financial need that's driving behavior that sort of overrules sanity and logic and, a general sense of fair play. There's also the sense of corporate fair play. Your corporate culture plays a very big role in this, in that everybody gets treated the same, the rules are the same for everyone, and they can see that everybody's sort of being treated on a level playing field. When you start to observe actions and your corporate culture breaks down, be that in a certain jurisdiction, a result of certain bad managers who demand performance or have a performance metric of 1, which, believe it or not, is out there, it's usually sales or profit, you start to see that culture break down and that sense of compliance and obligation to their fellow employees, their communities, and their company fall apart. And once that starts to happen, your culture degrades rapidly, and then it becomes a hindrance. Because now it's about, well, I've got to put the face on to stay within the boundaries of the organization, but I really have colluded with several other people, and now we're trying to win at all costs. And the hardest thing to find, at least from the accounting side, is the collusion. If it's a one-off player, it's not too hard to find out how they did it, because there's only so many schemes out there, and most of us have seen them 2 or 3 times by now. But if you have collusion, it becomes exponentially more difficult, and then the rationalization becomes not one person trying to look themselves in the mirror, but a group of people saying, now we're focusing on the greater good, and the more people involved, the easier it is to justify.
Right, and it's the corporate culture from the top as well drives many of these activities. So, part of the compliance program is tone at the top, but we have to make sure it's the correct tone at the top. And Marc brings up kind of an interesting scenario, the loophole theory. When I was in the FBI, I worked on the Enron case. And the Enron case is a perfect example of a bad tone at the top with a loophole. Now, many of the off-book transactions they were doing were legal under the accounting, right? But in order for them to take that and then strive for their personal gain, then would result in an off-book transaction on December 30th, so the business unit would make their number so they would all get their bonuses. And that happened literally every quarter in the Enron scandal. That one business unit would book a $50 million or $500 million gain because they monetized a contract which would probably never see daylight. And they did that every time. And again, it goes back to, the guys up top were doing it, the VPs were doing it. So then the manager in there is like, well, they're doing it and they're making their bonuses. I'm not going to get mine unless I do it. My supervisor is going to sign off on it. And there were literally emails within that is, all right, we're 2 weeks out of close. We need to find $50 million. And this would go out to all the employees. And lo and behold, someone would come up with a contract that they could monetize, get the income in for that quarter, and make their numbers.
I've seen that called the opportunity list at an organization that had an SEC restatement. It was literally a list kept by one of the senior controllers and the chief accounting officer that said, if we want to make the quarter, here's the opportunities to make the adjustments that are required to get there. And when that started getting circulated, you've sort of lost the culture war inside your organization.
And you're illustrating perfectly, the corporate culture that facilitates this type of behavior, where if you look at Wells Fargo and the numbers that they needed to achieve, although Wells Fargo had a very large compliance program they had compliance officers, okay? But what was the culture? And isn't it also, in terms of the culture, how people are compensated? Does that have an influence on their rationalization, where at the end of the quarter for their bonus, or 40% of their salary is based on those numbers, like a lot of corporation? What role does that play in terms of, you know, the culture and motivation and rationalization for them?
Okay, I can start on that one. People are, again, very smart, and you're looking at the more intelligent or more crafty or creative people within your organization that end up doing this. And people do what you pay them to do. I'm shocked multiple times when I go to a client, like, oh, we had a problem in this sales department in this foreign country because we knew we set the goal a little high, and then we put 25% on top of it. It was really aggressive. And they hit it, so we thought that was fantastic. But at the same time, you're looking at that and going, well, you just created the perfect environment for everybody to cheat. And then you rewarded them handsomely for it, and now you're surprised. So smart people will do what it takes to get paid. Everyone wants to be able to have nice things. And if you create a system where you've got one parameter, you're going to lose. I have a client that I was investigating, not really investigating, we were doing some proactive work on their compliance program and the anti-bribery, anti-corruption. And I was shocked that their sales department, instead of being the 20-80 rule, where you've got this really small base salary and 80% of it comes from their bonus and their sales activities, they flipped it around. Most of their sales folks, and these are port services companies, so you imagine all the marine ports all over the world. Most of those places are not in nice places. They're sort of the facilitation payment capital of the world is a port, right, usually. And they flipped it around and said, you know what, forget it. 80% of your salary is base. We're going to give you 20% bonus. But here's how it's going to work. If you want to bring a new client to us and you want us to sell goods to them inside a port, which is a high-risk area, we want to clear that client first. So you bring me a multinational company that's going to bring their ships in, we're going to service them. We want to look at them first. If we approve them, then you can go out and do your sales call and start your sales process. If we don't, you get credit for bringing a client to the table, but we're not going to pursue it because we don't want to be associated with that client because we've done our due diligence, and maybe it's, as Doug's presentation done, we've done a little bit of due diligence, we've Googled it, if you will, we've looked at some proprietary databases, and the reputation of that company isn't what we want. So they walk away, but they don't penalize their salespeople for that.
Yeah. So the recommendation, and there's récompense, there's an award for being ethical.
Yes.
In that
There's no
context.
penalty for being ethical.
Yes.
You will not be penalized if you do the right thing, but if you follow the process. And the minute people feel like the process has fallen apart on them and there's no longer an incentive to follow the process, and you're taking money out of their pocket, things go bad.
And one of the things, Bill, that you bring up is there's the sales target, there's the real one, and then there's the stretch one. And sometimes that's not communicated well with the employee base. And then once the stretch one is hit, it's like, oh, well, now the stretch one can be more. It's kind of a leapfrog effect. So in 3 or 4 quarters or 3 or 4 years or whatever the cycle is, you're literally asking your salespeople to do 50 or 80% more than you really that they really can do, and they're going to do whatever they can do because they're going to say, "Look, this is how I feed my family. Right. This is how I live."
But this goal setting is important, and when companies get into trouble, it's not so much that stretch goal wasn't a stretch goal, is that that's a stretch goal within a certain economic conditions and within a certain context. And when the lead of the organization, which is where most of these problems start, ignores that and says, you know what, I want 25% growth regardless of the market shrinking 12% in your jurisdiction. So now you've automatically set the game.
Skewed, yeah.
You've skewed the scorecard, and now you're telling people, I will penalize you for not hitting this. And when we do FCPA investigations, I do a lot of data analytics. Again, sorry, I'm the accountant. And what you see is a lot of companies look fairly well within their organization. Okay, I'm not taking this particular person out for 12 dinners that all cost $1,000 a piece. But they don't look at the analytics both in the organization and outside of the organization. And that goes for incentive plans as well.
You mean
What
for
is
comparison?
comparison?
Okay.
You can't operate out in a vacuum, in a silo. Everybody knows this. Compliance can't be in a silo. Neither can your compensation programs and how you incent your people. You have to be in line with the market.
I totally agree with what you guys said, and also I think if you think about it, directors have a responsibility to see, does it make sense? The result that they're showing me, does it make sense? In finance, we always say, when there is a high level of risk, you expect a high return. You're asking for a high return. So basically, if you have some contract on which you made a humongous return, you should ask yourself to say, well, there was probably a risk. If I did such a high return, there was probably a risk involved. Did I consider that risk? Did we actually did something wrong? Because when you're making too much profit compared to other people, you need to ask yourself, do I have the special recipe that I will never share with anyone? Or do I did something wrong that I don't want to share with anyone? So those are questions that I think should come across the mind of people sitting on board of directors, because they do have a responsibility when we're talking about the way they pay their commissions and stuff like that. Well, they technically are the ones who are supposed to oversee that. So they cannot say, well, you know, it was not my concern. We had someone to take care of that issue. No, now it's, especially in the US, so when you look at all the responsibilities that our directors now have with the Department of Justice, if you still want to be a director, you really have to have it down inside of your heart. Because
I think we have a question on the, down here.
Go ahead.
Reference Enron.
Hold on, I think we have a
Mike,
microphone.
please. Thank you.
And you can sing karaoke if you like, whatever.
They'll dance for you, too.
Yeah.
Hi. In reference to Enron, I have a question. This has always kind of bothered me, not understanding it, and you're all accountants, so maybe you can help me. In 2002, you know, they were criminally charged. Arthur Andersen was criminally charged for by the courts. In 2005, it was overturned only for Arthur Andersen because there was a problem that the jury wasn't given the right information. But nevertheless, they were originally charged with criminal activity as the auditors, and people counted on them to be, you know, checking on Enron and such. In your opinion, what motivated a firm like Arthur Andersen, one of the large 5 accounting firms, to go through and actually allow these practices to happen?
The bill, the monthly bill. Yeah. I mean, it was, you know, they basically Enron, in my opinion, which is not a Berkeley Research Group, the U.S. government, or any other person, is Enron basically audited themselves because they guided the auditors in a direction that for them to be able to do all this off-book stuff. I mean, Arthur Andersen got in trouble because they started shredding documents and they were lying and that kind of thing. But, you know, it's no different than any other big corporation in an audit firm relationship.
I think there is now and there always will be an expectation gap between what external audit, and I'm ex-Arthur Andersen, so let me put that disclaimer out there. Not involved in Enron. But there's always an expectation gap between what external auditors are perceived to be doing by the public and what they're actually able to do given the constraints of a budget, the timing constraints for their filings with the SEC, and just the level of skill that you can put out there and still make a profit. It is a pyramid, believe it or not. There's a partner at the top and a lot of junior associates that do most of the work. The profession recently has done a fairly good job of trying to close that expectation gap. And they start talking about, you have to talk about corruption and bribery. You have to talk about where could that happen. You almost have to do an audit risk assessment. In fact, you do have to do an audit risk assessment. And that's sort of closing the gap and allowing people to focus where they need to focus within an organization and have the entirety of the team understand the concept of where risk is at and how they need to address it and what they have to keep their eyes on or open for as they go through the audit. In the old days, you know, your first year you pushed the green button on the copier, and your second year you footed some schedules.
Don't tick and tie. Don't
Yeah, exactly. Did it match? Yes. Do you need to think? No. And that's starting to change because the public is demanding it. The other accounting firms are demanding it because of the negative ramifications, and literally they're getting sued and they're having to pay large settlements for not finding fraud, which is not the job of the external auditor. I heard it, I think, multiple times. It's management's responsibility, but it's the accountability or expectation gap between the two. Arthur Andersen is a perfect example of a failure and of that expectation or of that gap being wider than it should have been. and basically poor performance. People got, incented, lazy, incented, didn't share information with their team, didn't approach the job at the team, and thought power was information, or information was power, more likely. And they kept it to themselves because they knew something was wrong, but they couldn't quite figure it out because you have to have the expertise there.
Right. And Arthur Andersen had issues with not just Enron. They were involved with several other of the big restatements during that time.
But in fairness, all of the big six at that time
yes.
had issues.
Yes.
And again, that we've done some work within the industry to close that expectation gap.
And I think that being an accountant myself, but in Canada, I was working for one of the big four also. And one of the issue that we had was every time that we were producing an auditor's report, it was always based on the generally accepted accounting principles, and we were referring to the generally accepted accounting standards, auditing standards. So basically, we were just saying we're going to do what we need to do to meet the standards. And I think that maybe Arthur Andersen were more aggressive to say, well, our generally accepted perception of something is kind of different. So I think that if we do just that type of work, that should be enough. And I think with Enron, what also happened was that the chief financial officer, who self-proclaimed himself a chief loophole officer at the end, Andrew Fasta, what he was saying was that he was trying and trying and trying to find different ways, and he was bouncing it back with internal audit. And then he went even to the external auditors to say, if I was to structure the deal that way, would that fly? And then
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. And the opinion of Arthur Andersen was these special purpose entities were legitimate accounting transactions. And frankly, according to the literature, they are. But there's certain, when you go beyond that, and again, it's how much investigation does the auditor do? Now for us, so several of these special purpose entities, I mean, I don't know if you remember the names like Raptor and, they were all, they did have good names. I'll give them that.
They were creative.
But if you get into them, there's certain economical factors that have to be there. So one of them is that Enron has to have, and frankly, it wasn't even very much, and my recollection is 5%, it may even be 10%, but 10% of the structure had to be at risk for Enron. Well, so they would go out and get all these big banks to finance these off-book transactions, but in the end, the 10% wasn't even, they would get loans for the 10% and back it with Enron stock. Well, you have all these special purpose entities backed with Enron stock. Well, when Enron stock goes from 180 to 30, okay, we got a problem.
I think the larger issue is, we talked about it, form over function, or if you look at IFRS versus GAAP, these are rules-based accounting is what he's describing, and everybody wanted to see whether they fit within the narrow confines of the rules, and they forgot that it was a principle. And once you do that or conflate the two, now you're in a whole different game. And that game doesn't serve the public, it doesn't serve your clients, and it certainly doesn't serve the company you're working with or for at the time. Again, I'm ex-Arthur, so I get to say that. That's one of the problems you have with the U.S. wanting to adopt IFRS, which is international standards, is because we have a lot of smart people who make a whole lot of money figuring out how to go around the rules. And it's like doing your taxes on a 5x7 card they want to do in the U.S. now. You're going to put a whole lot of people out of business, so there's a whole lot of people who have a vested interest in the system as it is. So that shift is not going to occur overnight. And don't forget, accounting firms are firms and groups of people just like a company. So the same bad actors, the same incentives are out there.
Right, exactly.
And that's what. And you can't give a public accounting company a pass on that. It's made up of people. Right. Who will make mistakes and who have things go wrong and get incented the wrong way, as Doug mentioned.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings this all back to even actually what we're talking about, is the culture of that particular Enron team at Arthur Andersen. Well, if you see the partner doing something, bending the rule to make it fit, well, I can guarantee you the manager is going to bend the rule because they need to make the partner happy. And the staff person sees the manager bend the rule.
It's a cascading effect.
Yeah.
And it cascades all throughout the organization. And that's what's going to happen. That's what happens in any organization where the culture is circumvented by
Yeah.
individuals.
And that's why when you talk about anti-bribery, anti-corruption, and you talk about whistleblowers, you also talk about conflicts of interest and non-retaliation being one of the keys. Because if you penalize the person that kind of put their hand halfway up and said, you know what, this doesn't quite look right, and that hand gets lopped off almost instantaneously, again, you've invested all this
Chilling
time.
effect for the rest of the employees.
It stops everything. And that's terrible for an organization.
And it's interesting.
And I have a part two to the question, sorry.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I'll pass on the mic. I've got three experts, I want to get my answers, so I might as well ask them. The other question I have, like, for instance, in the States at least, in May, I think it was May 1st, the AICPA came out with the SAA 18, which now has three other areas that have to be looked at. You know, and are they compliant in these certain areas, including, you know, risk and getting it, you know, very heavy into the cyber risk and such, and looking at those. And now the accountant has to say, I attest that this is true, and you can count on this. Where before, when they did the SOC 2, yeah, we think it's pretty good. Now, you can hold me liable. And that's in the States, and that's new. And companies, so you know, a lot of companies aren't still doing the SAA 16, not the 18 yet, but they're going to be converting this year. My question is, when we have clients who want us to do due diligence for them, or we have firms that have third parties in other countries that don't have this, and it's new here, we don't know how well it's going to work. How do we go and say, okay, this is the review they've had done in that country? And before, we used to be able to say, years ago, before Enron and before these things, and say, all right, this is what their auditing firm said, this is what their accounting firm said. How far do you recommend going and doing a third-party review of the third parties, or the fourth parties, if you will? You know, of the people that are actually attesting to them and saying that, yes, they have good things in place and such. And that's my last question.
Go ahead.
Oh, great, so, okay.
Yeah, you're the auditor.
hot
You said
seat
you
is-
said you're the
yeah,
auditor.
I
You specifically said that.
Bit
Yes.
that one off, didn't I? First off, you have to have the idea of reasonable assurance, and that's very common for everybody. And it is ratcheting up both. And another example, which is not quite dead on, but close, is the New York Department of Financial Services are now making compliance officers attest that their BSA AML programs, Anti-Money Laundering Bank Securities Act compliance programs, are in compliance, and they're personally responsible, and now they've got criminal liability attaching. So as you said, this is something new. We're kind of going to watch to see how this plays out. And I'll give you the counter argument too, because we have this with clients. You know, hey, I really want to make sure my suppliers are following the rules. I'm going to take my policies and procedures and make them follow them. I'm going to take my training and I'm going to put it on them. And then all of a sudden, somewhere along the line, you're effectively controlling part of your third party. So now did you assume all the liability of that third party? I mean, part of the reason you have a third party is to shift some liability outside your organization. Not 100% of it, not blindly, not, you know, here, hand off the football and run the other way, but you're essentially, from a legal perspective, paving the yellow brick road right back to your front door. Like, hey, they violated this. Well, your policy didn't say anything about it, and now we go from rules to principles again. So when we do due diligence, or when I do it in Latin America, I'm less concerned about the exact, I don't like this clause. When people start to negotiate phrases with me, I'm more worried than when people say, look, I want to do business with you. How do I do business with you? What's acceptable and what's not acceptable? And they start having a conversation. When the lawyers get in the room and we're doing paragraph subset A, paragraph II, or whatever the hell it is, we've lost. We've lost because we're not having a conversation about principles of substance. We're having a conversation about how do I get to check the box. And once you start down that path, you're going to end up in the wrong place. Right. And I know that's not an exact answer for you, and I apologize for that up front.
I actually like.
That is a very good answer.
I really like your analogy, because it keeps on. This is the paperwork. These are the rules you have to follow, and it's not about the big picture, about the ethical standards of the company and values of the company that you're trying to espouse to your third party or your agent or your partner. And it's important because, again, the rationalizations are going to come in, you know, these rules. Right. Because it's again, the underlying message, whether it's overt or covert, that you need to make those numbers at the end. Right. So is there any other question from the audience yet? No? Okay. Oh, yes. Go ahead, sir.
Gentlemen, I had a question about what efforts can be made about entrenched corruption in certain organizations. To give you some background, I want to ask about entrenched corruption in marine ports in Canada. Canada has numerous marine ports. The three largest are the Port of Vancouver, the Port of Montreal, the Port of Halifax. The largest marine gateway for drugs into Canada is not the Port of Montreal. Contrary to the myth, it's through the Port of Vancouver. Using the Port of Montreal as an example, the statistics about the Port of Montreal are just astounding in terms of the land area, the number of people employed. Organized crime groups have influence at the Port of Montreal. For at least, I think, 50 years, the Irish-Canadian West End Gang controls who gets to work. There are obviously people there who are looking out for certain marine containers. The Hells Angels actually have people working at all three ports that I mentioned, Vancouver, Montreal, Halifax. So the question I have is, if you have stevedores, if you have people employed who are checking bills of lading, if you have actual checkers who are supposed to look at marine containers, and because there are so many marine containers coming into, let's say, the Port of Montreal, and obviously any port that has that many marine containers, they can't all be checked. What can the Port Authority, the government do to stem entrenched corruption that has been going on for decades?
That's quite a question
Yeah.
you're asking for this panel. Yes, go ahead.
I might start off by saying sometimes the reason why people actually participate in those illegal activities is because they only see the money at the end. They don't see the effect of what the wrongdoing they are doing. So I would say if you actually try to inform your employees at those different ports to say, you know what, when you participate, the drug that you actually let in the country, this is the effect it has on the community, the fentanyl or whatsoever. So you make them realize that they participate in something that they might think it's only there just to take advantage of the system and make a couple of extra bucks or whatsoever. But you have to sense about it, like make them realize that what they're doing has large effect. As he was pointing out a few minutes ago, if the person works alone, that's one thing. If the person, there is collusion, then it's always harder. So the only way you can have an effect on people when there is collusion is to make it broad announcement to say, guys, we don't tolerate it. If it ever happens, this will be the consequences. Your union rep or whatsoever will not be able to protect you. There will be effect, and it will be publicized, and think of all the damage that you will do, because when we'll publicize it, we'll take a spin in which to say you actually participated in maybe the increase of fentanyl or death, and so that might be one of
Name and shame.
being changed.
Yeah. Couple of things. I'm no port expert, so let me put that out there first. Take it back for just a second. We do a lot of work on third-party due diligence. We almost do none on employee due diligence. So that's the first place, and we've seen this. I work in the mining industry in all kinds of places. No one has. Those locations are not on anyone's bucket list to visit before they retire. But in those markets, there's an inordinate amount of time spent on employee due diligence, which is almost equated to vendor due diligence for the same reason. Who is this person? Do they have an organized crime? Are they related to the local chief? Have they had political issues? Are they a member of a gang? So the thing you can do first is kind of stop new entrants into the door, and then you have to focus on culture and changing who's actually in your organization. And we always like to say employee discipline is part of everything we've talked about all weeks, up to and including termination. Well, every once in a while, a public execution helps. And by that I mean, it's not necessarily a name and shame, but if you find egregious behavior and as management, your first thing is, oh God, I don't want to admit this in public. I need to push this guy out the back door quietly at 12:01 a.m. But there's a downside to that, in that you have anybody who thought about speaking up, and even with the non-retaliation policies in place, are now less likely because they can't see their ramifications to bad behavior, and there wasn't a penalty. Okay? If you're gainfully employed and you're getting away with it and management never really does anything about it, you're perpetuating the behavior, and lo and behold, you as management are responsible. It's as simple as that. Are these things easy to do? Are they safe to do? No. If you haven't had a death threat in these situations, you're probably not doing your job properly, especially in some jurisdictions. That's how we measure it. I've had community relationship managers have been beat up and stabbed in Latin and Africa. And that's not a good thing, but sooner or later when they go out there and the tone doesn't change, the message doesn't change, and their cousin got fired because they did something wrong, people will come around. It's not an instantaneous thing, and it may take a generation to get weeded all out. But the first thing you do is shut the door. And then you start actually doing the things that you say you do. Make your policies real and act on them. And if you need help from law enforcement, you need help from security, you need help from consultants. I don't know how many times I've been the bad guy. If I show up, your day is officially shot, because no one wants to talk to a forensic accountant who interviews people for a living trying to find fraud. I'm not the good guy, I never will be. Run the other way if you see my face at your front door. It's not a good thing. But there's a reason for that, because it allows management to say, look, we're taking this seriously. We brought in an expert or a consultant to handle this, and they're going to help us change our policy. And even if nothing changes instantaneously, it shows an effort on behalf of management. People are paying attention, investments are being made, and there's a conscious effort to change, which makes the rationalization more difficult down the road. Like, hey, didn't they fire the last 3 guys they caught with that? Didn't they prosecute one of them because it was just egregious? Wasn't his family shamed? He can't show up at church anymore. Those things have an effect. It's not an instantaneous effect, but it does have an effect. And to ignore it and say, I can't fix it, it's the same as always, you're part of the problem in essence. And I can't understate how difficult that is and how costly that is, and how that will shake up an organization and you will have multiple problems in the short term. But in the long term, you'll come out in a better place, hopefully. Sorry. The FBI guy probably has a very much a slam the door and, where's the rubber hose, and we'll get this sorted out tomorrow.
Stereotyping.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I think,
It works, right?
and again, I didn't work a lot of organized crime per se. I think you find the same thing in the U.S. with underpaid police officers who then turn and, one, they're not making enough money, and the criminals are going to pay them not to look the other way. And that's never going to stop, right? On the docks, the gangs that run the docks, that run the employees, that run the unions, they're always going to try to find a way to get their drugs in the country. So as Bill mentioned, the stopgap then for the Port Authority or whoever is the people that are allowing it is figure out then, what motivates them? Why do they do it? It could be, hey, if you don't do it, I'm going to kill your sister. Because, these are
Real world consequences.
real world people, right?
Yeah.
Organized crime is, if you listen to Joe last night, they don't mess around. So it's almost it's a very dangerous situation, and you can tell the people on the dock, well, look, we don't bribe people, and if you don't do your job, you're going to get fired. They were like, all right, well, I'll take a chance, and because I don't want to die.
Right.
And it's real, and organized crimes like that.
Yeah. The best you can hope for is mitigation and management at the end of the day. And
You'll never eliminate it.
You're never going to eliminate
Let's
it.
be clear. But the thing is, I think it's important to look at this because it's a very complex issue. And you have to look at the solution from an ecosystem perspective that multiple players need to take action. It has to be a collective effort. So as Marc mentioned, in terms of education, to really put the big picture of this type of action, because a lot of these actions, people don't realize the real consequences of all this. And they have kids and they're asked questions. And for some, the narrative will connect to them. Others, it's the onboarding in terms of checks and balances as to who exactly are employees and where they come from. And, because the sensitive area, this is a high risk area. We've talked about the last 2 days. You've got high risk, then you have to do enhanced due diligence. So that should be part of the process. And from the criminal perspective, this is where you come in, bring in law enforcement and others to be able to mitigate it so that there's a presence. Because you want to make it harder for people to do, the wrongdoings. You want to show the bad actors that there's a price to pay and there's a high risk to do this. We'll never eliminate it. But if you facilitate it, if you just don't do anything and it's a status quo, then it's an open door policy. And it will perpetuate and it actually grows. Cancer is going to grow. So at least you need to do something proactive to be able to mitigate it, and being visible. Being visible and constant is going to be important. Now, any other question?
Thank you. Hopefully I got close to the answer.
Okay. We talk about bad actors and we talk about the environment or the culture. What within that culture, within the policy, facilitates the action of the bad actors, and what can help mitigate and address it?
Well, I think that when the policies are not clear, when you actually make it something, say, well, you know what, we don't tolerate that type of behavior, but you don't talk about the action that you will take. That is something that needs to change. You need to say, we don't tolerate it, and this is what will happen. If you don't tell them what will be the consequences, sometimes it just won't work, unfortunately. Something also you have to realize is that if people on top do things and they get away with it, as we were pointing out before, well, the people, and because realize something, sometimes people see the other one that are the boss or the CEOs, whoever, as being mentor. And we're talking more and more about mentorship all the time now. It's pretty cool these ways to talk about mentorship. Well, if your mentor is someone who has no ethical values or whatsoever, you're in trouble. He may be very successful, he may be recognized by his peer as being someone very nice, but you need to make sure that the policies are clear and they say what are accepted and what is not accepted. I'll give you an example. With universities and colleges now, you are not allowed to claim expense if you go out for dinner with some people and there was food and alcohol. So they say as soon as there is alcohol, you're not allowed to claim it. So what people did at one point, they said, okay, well, let's have two different invoices, one for the food, one for the alcohol. That was all cool. So we were able to claim the one for the food, but you were not able to claim the amount for the alcohol. But then the loophole people said, hey, we found a way to get out of it. Instead, they go see the person they report to, and they say, you know what, I have a receipt for $100 for alcohol. So what I will do is instead I'll claim travel expense. So I'll say I did 250 kilometers, so you owe me $100, and I'll just destroy the alcohol receipt, and you'll pay me for it, and then you'll be complying. And they say, yeah, you're right, that's right, okay, I can actually pay you for travel expense, but I'm not allowed to pay you for alcohol. Well, it's once you start accepting those type of behavior within the organization that you do have a problem. You need to say the people at the top have to be the compliance officers, even though they don't have that specific title. Because the problem is, and problem or maybe the solution, actually, I should say, the younger generation, the millennial, they don't believe in those type of behavior anymore. So the danger with them is not that they're going to be using the whistle-blowing hotline, is that they'll take their cell phone, they'll take picture, or they'll record and they will upload stuff in the media. And once the media gets a hold of it, then it becomes very dangerous, because reporters, they're not subject to the same requirement that police officers are. A police officer, to put something out in the media or to go public and press charges whatsoever, you need to have supporting evidence that are unbelievable. On the other hand, investigative reporters, they say, oh, well, we got that information and we're sharing it. And it's up to you to make your mind, kind of. So that is the one thing. If we don't change the culture, it's going to become very dangerous, because I think that the new generation will have their own little whistle-blowing method, which will be on the internet.
All right. I'll play devil's advocate on that one from a policy perspective. I'm not a fan of detailed policies. I'm a fan of broad policies that don't regulate personal behavior in every situation, in every bar, in every corner or port in the globe. Your policy should be very general, state your principles.
Okay.
If you have a good resourced and effective compliance department, you will have to allow some thought and some judgment to occur along the way. And that judgment has to include the context of where you're operating, what you're doing, what your risks are to your employees if you're talking about personal safety in some places that you probably shouldn't venture. And if you allow that leeway and say, look, we're not going to try and mandate your behavior down to it's a white shirt or a blue shirt with a blue or a red tie, we're going to give you some leeway, but these are the clear markers on either side where if you cross the line, there will be penalties. But inside that, we're going to use professional judgment. We don't expect you to have all the answers. We expect you to know when to raise your hand, ask a question, find your compliance officer, find your HR person, and figure out, hey, it is a cocktail reception. The thought of not having alcohol at a cocktail reception sounds kind of silly. Well, let's not try and mandate that, but let's say, look, we set a limit. Here's the local limit based on the culture. Tell the French they can't have wine and you're going to have problems. So let's live in the real world now and not a Pollyannic kind of state where everything's utopian and it works, because your employees are out in the real world. They're going to encounter real situations and they need to know that the company has their back and that they're not going to be penalized for something mundane and silly, and they're going to be looking for the larger issues in protecting the organization. Because if an employee feels like you'll stick up for them and have their back if something goes wrong, you may have to discipline them later, but look, bring it to me, we'll figure it out, we'll solve it. If there's discipline involved, I promise you it would be fair.
But Bill, are you not assuming that that's in the perfect world where the culture within the company allows this and it's propagated where come to me and we'll help you, we'll guide you, as opposed to a lot of companies that don't have, the people inside don't feel confident that they can.
They don't, and that relies on the culture that, open communication is sort of a
Yes.
given, open door policy. All these things have been around for
Oh, yeah.
20 plus years.
But
in
it's how it's
practice,
applied.
yeah, they don't quite work as well. So maybe I'm being the Pollyanna in the room, I guess. But there has to be a balance
Yes.
in between.
Right, yeah.
And striking that is art, not science, and it's certainly not math, so that leaves me out of the equation. But there has to be an effort to try.
In a culture that's based on ethics, that would work really well, because you trust your people, here are the parameters, and we know you're going to do the right thing. It's like when we taught our teenagers, I trust you to do the right thing, and my kids always told me, I hate it when you do this because you were right there, and I had to make the right decision. Well, the same thing with the employees. But it's that culture that is the base of it. And if you have a culture that is just on that next quarter and that bonus,
Yeah. Yeah,
Well-
the culture is the base, and having the resources. Like, you can't leave somebody on an island and expect them to make
Yes.
the right decision. If you have, and all of the ABAC stuff is adequate compliance resources. Well, what do those look like? Is that an HR manager? Is that a compliance officer for every region of the world? Or is that the guy who quarterly goes to a meeting with the global compliance team and they talk about the problems they've encountered, they talk about the health lines, they communicate what they've learned and what the ramifications are. And if you educate, to your earlier point, people get smarter, they feel more comfortable in their actions, and they're less likely to do something that's contrary to those bright
Right.
lines you put on the left and the right of your policies. And I think it's possible. Now, again, it will take a number of years to get the culture where you want it, and it takes a week to destroy it. One bad apple that doesn't get punished, constant vigilance is understated as a requirement to all this.
trust and verify.
Yeah, trust but verify.
Doug, you have a?
Well, I was just, I think that also then brings us to, that all works and works well, and I think companies are really striving to get here. And the internal control function then that they put in place for then to give employees that comfort, right? So if the internal control function is like, if you're gonna take out a public official, you have to do X, Y, and Z. So they know that that's the process, that's what they have to do. And if they do that, and they know they have someone they can talk to about it, hey, I'm gonna take out this person, here's what it's gonna be, is that gonna meet the standard?
Yeah, and that person's not going to be seen as the bonus squatcher, but,
Right.
business facilitator.
Facilitator. How
Yes.
do I do this properly
Yes.
and not put myself, the company, or the person I'm actually having lunch with at risk? I can't take out an SEC guy in Miami and buy him a cortadito. It's $2.25. He doesn't do it because his policy is, look, tip the waitress for the $2.25. I'm not taking it. It's just I'm not comfortable. These are the rules. This is how I play the game. And if you're open about that, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to have an issue with either side.
Now, you talked about the foreign aspect, and it dovetails in the fact that in Canada, you can have your rules, and it's you know, well, the parameters are there, and it's easy because there's a lot of predictability. But when you're facing various challenges in different jurisdictions, different cultural ethos, your policies need to be adapted to that. And you know, well, the theory of when you in Rome, do as the Roman do, and you're there, and everybody, it's a culture of corruption. So how do you mesh all this to realize having got cultural intelligence and to adapt your approach, your values, and your policies to guide your employees working in that environment where they face all these pressures in terms of business and the fact that, you know, it's rife with corruption?
Well, I think that, like Bill was pointing out before, I think that you need to take into consideration your principles, and then you define your rules based on your principles. So that being said, it's true that you may have to adapt in some jurisdiction to make sure that you will not offend people or that you will not put your health or your physical at risk. You don't want that to happen. You want to make sure, and I think it was Bob this morning that was pointing out also, you will maybe accept something, you will document it, and you will take action after. You always want to protect yourself, you want to protect your employees, but you need to think always to say, it's going to go back to the principle. Do we agree with doing those things? If not, then it's an exception, and we're going to document it, then we're going to take action to correct it. Sometimes I saw some people receiving gift and said, you know what, I'm not allowed to, but if you still want to give it to me because it's part of your culture or whatsoever, we're going to take that gift, bring it back, we're going to have an auction, and we're going to give the money to local charities on your name. But keep in mind, this will not give you back any favor. If you actually did that, it's a sign of respect, perfect, we'll take it, but don't expect anything in return, and put it in writing, just to make sure it's clear.
But the policies should also be adapted to culture, because, you know, gifts and entertainment, what is acceptable here at $50 or $100 is a king's ransom in certain jurisdictions. So,
And that's why your policies need to be broad in scope and locally customized by someone who understands the context. And you're going to pay a personal price for it. I sat for 4 hours in a police station in Peru when I worked for AB Volvo, because I got into an accident. I could have paid the cop off and been out of there in 3.5 minutes. 4.5 hours later, I've got 3 lawyers with me in the police station trying to explain what happened in my broken Spanish, which I assure you is terrible. Their perfect Spanish. The cops sooner or later are going to get frustrated that, you know what, this financial endeavor has failed. I've got 4 people in my office all trying to explain why their CEO at the moment messed up in a traffic situation, is now sitting in a chair growing increasingly uncomfortable. But if I do that, that's that leadership thing. They're never going to think it's okay that if they get into an accident with a company vehicle, they just go ahead and pay the cops off. Because they're like, where is he? 3 meetings ago he was supposed to be here. And I'm like, I'm in the police station and I'm not leaving.
because I'm not paying.
I'm not paying. We'll do this the hard way. And then when I call the judge, who's a friend of mine, and this guy, because, you know, like most places, it's a small group of families that run the company or are influential within the country and the corporate or legal environment. And you suddenly make it so costly to keep you in that chair. They're just like, look, get out of here. And
you're also setting the tone, because once you start paying a small bribe, you mark yourself as willing to play within the game. And then that first bribe always evolves into more and more and more frequent bribe and higher bribes, because you're told the whole audience that is asking for a bribe that you're willing to play the game.
And the grapevine travels faster than any cell phone on the planet.
Yes. Any question on the last topic? Yes? No? Maybe? Okay. It was discussed that compliance is the floor and not the ceiling, meaning that compliance is just the beginning. Can you expand on that in terms of how it impacts individuals and their behavior?
Okay, well, I'm going to take an example of the accounting world, because since we're both accountants, and
Here we go.
here we go. Because keep in mind, most people who commit fraud are accountants, so let's not forget
Don't
about
trust
that.
them.
We're always
You're saying don't
involved at
trust
one
them.
point or the other. So one thing, if you were to compare an auditor's report the one from in North America with one from in Germany, for example. The first thing that you would find out is to be able to understand what is written, you need to have a MBA level type of education to understand the one that is actually done in North America compared to a fourth grade level of education you would need in Germany. Why? Because in Germany it's clear. They say they do comply to that portion of the law. Bang, that's it, that's all. If you were to read an auditor's report in Canada, it says, in all material respect, fairly represent the generally acceptable accounting principle and now the international financial reporting standards. Even for accountants, it's really complicated. And then we tell our students, we say, you know what? If it's an opinion without any reserve, there should be 3 paragraphs. So just look at the number of paragraphs. Don't even have to read it. 3 paragraphs, it's the standard auditor's report. If there's a reserve, then there'll be a 4th paragraph. Just look at the 4th. It's really weird. So, but why are we able to do so? Because under what he was pointing out, professional judgment. We say, as an accountant, we have a professional judgment. And my professional judgment dictate that. Well, I was from Deloitte, he was from Arthur Andersen. We probably have different professional judgment. Then it's based on the education that we got, the work experience that we got. That, according to me, is very dangerous. If we just say, well, I'm complying to the rules and the principles, that's it, that's all. Well, no, I have to go a little bit further than that to say, hey, do I feel good about it? Do I feel comfortable? The little voice inside my head, does it say, you know what, Mark, you're all good with what you did? And I think that saying complying is the floor. It's so true, because it should go up to the roof should be your ethics. How do you feel about it? If the media was to call you and say, Mark, can you explain why you did it that way? This is, to me, the level of standard that we should always operate on. That's why I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, what is legal is not always what is ethical, I think is how the saying goes. And you want to be legally compliant in every jurisdiction in which you operate, but you want your employees to be ethically compliant with the ethos of the organization. And if you can strike the balance between the two of those, you'll never be under the floor. And that's the whole idea, is you want to have aspirational goals but minimum requirements. Because the accountants will show you exactly how to get the minimum requirements, and then hopefully you can step up from there. And professional judgment aside, I also work for another big 4, so. But yeah, I mean, but what was the kernel of truth to that was, you have to be professional, you have to have experienced people, and they're making a judgment call. The question is their judgment appropriate? Do they have the experience? Like every compliance officer, do they have the experience? Do you know what you're talking about in the context in which you're operating? And far too often we have people who want to make a judgment call, and this is the one thing that upsets me more than anything, is your compliance chief sits in New York and your risk is in Saudi Arabia. Or, you know, I'm sitting in the safest place in the world and I'm running my compliance group from my ivory tower or my brick tower or whatever tower you're in. And when you look across globally and do your risk assessment, well, I've got 60 auditors. I'm like, great, where are they located? New York and Chicago. I'm like, fantastic, where's your risk? There's Nigeria, South Sudan, I have some stuff in Chad, and I'm like, great, how many of your people have ever been to those locations? Are you kidding? It's personally risky to go there. And I'm looking at them like, okay, obviously you flunked the part of the test where the risk assessment actually needs to be a material part of what you do. And it laughably happens more often than I'd love to see, because you want to have a good compliance program and you end up with a paper tiger, yes, or dragon, if you will. And then when you go to put it in practice, you discover that you don't have the right talent and right resources. And to shift that in today's corporate environment is the magic that I haven't quite figured out yet, to be completely honest. That takes some work and some real salesmanship, which again, I'm an accountant, don't have. But if you need to try and move your organization that way, is to say, look, we've got to address the risks as we have them. Maybe 6 attorneys in New York is not the right way to do it. Maybe we should take 3 attorneys in New York and then 2 in Europe or a couple in South Africa or wherever, and adjust us where our risk is at. And that way you're sure that you're meeting the minimum obligations in the right context, and then you can come up, and when your corporate ethics program, you know, gets rolled out, and as you acquire or expand business, you have a basis to explain, you have a resource that knows all the acronyms you like to use in whatever local market you're in, because everybody has a different name for whatever it is.
Yeah, because ultimately, if there's an investigation, the investigators are going to go
Oh, yeah.
to that location. They're
Yeah.
going to ask questions of the local employees.
I'll be locally, and I'll be there at behalf of the external counsel. And when they say they've never heard or can't name the compliance officer, and they look at you funny, we say, well, who do you go to? Oh, I go to my supervisor. Oh, fantastic. What's his background? Oh, he started in a coal mine 2 years before I did. Okay, fantastic. He's very experienced. Has he ever had a compliance training? What are you, nuts? We go
I'm on the line.
I'm on the line. I don't train. And then you start going down those discussions, and you're in the unenviable position of going back to that corporate attorney or that general counsel and saying, guys, you've made some tactical errors, and it's going to take a while to recover from them, and the government is not going to give you any credit for what you have. And then your monitorship is not 1 year, it's
Yeah,
3.
3, 4, 5, yep.
Yeah, or you, God forbid, have another instance, because even during that monitorship, you have a
Oh, yep.
recurrence. And it's happened, and then you're forced to go to the other extreme, which if you think we're expensive when you engage us periodically, try paying me full-time at my BRAC rate for a year, because nobody trusts you, including the US government, to do your job. And that's the ultimate penalty of when your compliance floor was violated and your ethics program didn't
And
do
it would have been
anything.
so much cheaper had you done your due diligence properly in the first place.
Yeah, exponentially. And that's the other thing. Yeah, all the FCPA fines, I mean, you look at all the, $6 billion in last year was FCPA fines in the US alone. Now, we shared a great portion of that with Brazil. I think it was 2.8
Yes.
for Aldebrecht.
Aldebrecht, yeah.
But that's only a portion of it. That's what you ended up paying. You stroked a check for that. But the other checks went to your lawyers, to your accountants, to your advisors, to a whole new
Yeah,
compliance
and
team.
it's a multiplying factor as to the cost that you just.
Yeah, it's exponential, unfortunately.
Yep.
And people forget that, oh, you know, it's only 100. The average fine, you exclude all these things, is 30 million or whatever it turns out to be. I can write that check. I'm Ford Motor Company. I can write that check. That's in the 4th digit of rounding on my EPS. Now multiply that times 6 or 7 and find out where that EPS multiple is really at. And then you've got the damage to your reputation in the market, which takes another hit, which was a great study from George Mason University about how long it takes to get your stock value back after you've had a compliance issue, because now the board suddenly with it, nobody trusts me. And how do I win that back? And if you're Wells Fargo, you're going to be struggling with that for years because they just had another instance.
Yes,
And which proves that.
it seemed like they're learning very well.
Well, they're learning, but you're assuming you caught all the problems the first shot out. I got it. It was just this problem. We're going
Yeah,
to
but the
shut this
focus was-
down.
Their focus was very narrow.
Right. You solved a problem without, again, stepping back and say, what are the problems that could have occurred? Should I have perhaps looked in these 4 other places where I had the exact same sales incentive program going on, we were just selling something else? And then your credibility, when your CEO gets up there and says, we've got it, and then 6 months later the press says, oh, whoops, you don't. And then you cost people their jobs and their livelihoods, and it's all preventable, or should be preventable, I guess I should say. Remember, I can't do my Pollyanna thing. It should be preventable.
Doug, have anything?
No.
Okay.
He's hungry.
Any question from the audience at all?
Oh, wait.
Oh, yes.
Thank you for your presentations, and I'll try to make myself good in English to be understood. So what I want to say is we noticed that when the organization wants to deal with corruption and send messages to the employees, it's always focused on compliance, code of ethics. It's like what the organization is expecting. But the organization never think about working about factors that raise or favorize the misbehavior of employees. And I think the major one is the belonging, the feeling of belonging to the organization. It's the same thing when yesterday we spoke about belonging to a country. The most countries where corruption is present is countries where the feeling of inequity is very high between people, and they feel that they are not treated equal. The same thing is in organizations. So we usually use to send messages, but we never raise the belonging, the feeling of being proud to belong into the organization, and improve the climate of work and the climate of confidence, and to try to improve the way people are working, because I think I work in ethics, and usually people want to do things right.
Yeah.
Yes.
They want to feel also being treated equally, and they want to feel that they are a part of the organization. They are not on the last level in
Right.
the organization. So this is where, and I think there was a study in ethics which proved that the feeling of the perception of inequity is like a major factor that push people to act like misbehave or
Yeah.
doing.
They want to feel valued.
Yeah. So this is what I want to say. I
Any
hope
comments on that, gentlemen?
I was understood.
No, thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. I'll take it back into the anti-bribery, anti-corruption space for a moment, and I apologize for that. We talked, at least in one of the sessions, about activity-based key performance indicators or measurements and impact-based. And what's the difference? And if it's 96.6% passage on your training, all well and good, doesn't mean anything, doesn't help people feel like they belonged or anything. What does? You have impact KPIs. One of my favorite is employee surveys, where you actually ask the tough questions. Now, you get one, and I work with a gentleman who does surveys for a living on BRG in New York. He's phenomenal at it. But his first caution on day one with a client is, if you do this and you do this right and you do nothing with the results, you're going to be worse off than you were before. Because employees will give you their feedback. They want to be heard. They want to contribute. They want to do the right thing. If you ignore them, it's worse than not doing anything at all. So you have to have a mechanism to communicate the feedback, to get everybody involved, perform teams. When it gets all that HR, compliance, everything is interrelated. And if you try and slice it up into a silo, you're going to make mistakes. But it's great. Exit interviews, employee surveys, customer service surveys, although I'm not very fond of those because the customer is always right. Just ask them, and it's not the case. Especially in a lot of places, I'm one of those weird people who says, you know what, I've fired customers for reasons, and I don't feel bad about it at all. If you're more trouble than you're worth, if you're more risky than you think you are, if you're failing to listen to the advice I'm giving you, I will see you in 6 months, I will see you in a year, or I'll read about you in the front page of the Miami Herald, which is my local paper. And that sounds really childish and mean, but it's a reflection of everybody needs to keep learning. And when you get a level of management or an employee, or you feel like you've got it all figured out, that's the point where the danger starts and your culture starts to turn in on itself. And I'm GE and I know how to do things perfectly, and there's never a mistake, and Chainsaw Jack and the whole guys, that doesn't work. Rank and riff didn't work for a while. I have a bunch of ex-GE friends that are like, that was hell on wheels. I learned a lot, but I also learned what not to do when I was now managing a different company. And I've sat in the chair of CEO, CFO, and the hardest part about sitting in that chair is worrying every day that you're making the mistakes that when you were lower in the organization, you hated. And to learn from your own mistakes and make sure you don't make them again and take advice from employees. When we start FCPA investigations, I don't start with the CEO. I start with a guy who just came out of the hole in the mine and said, how's this place run?
That's right.
I go sit down and have a coffee. They're like, where did wasn't he wearing a suit? Where did he go? I'm sitting in the coffee shop down there, or the Roach Coach, sorry, that's what we call him in Miami. I'm sitting at the coffee truck just having a conversation. And I'll do that for a day or two to figure out how this place works. Because I don't care what the CEO says on day one. I care what he says later in the process. I care a lot what he says later in the process, because I'm testing the veracity of it against what its employees say. Sorry, I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, I think the best part of your question was, all in all, I believe people in general want to do the right thing. I mean, it's sometimes hard to tell in today's society with some of the things that are going on, but I think the inner self, if you're given the opportunity to do the right thing, you will. And if companies within their compliance function or their managerial function let employees know that, listen, you're important to us, we want to hear what you say, and you make them belong. that company then is on a path to success. And I think that the way you mentioned that in your question, that's spot on to what is what you need to make your employees feel. Absolutely.
And I would add up on that one to say that the new generation, they work on their branding. They care about their image. They will go work somewhere, and if they find out that there is something that is not going the way it should, that it is non-ethical, well, they'll either report it or they're just going to leave. And because to them, their integrity is part of their branding, and they're very focused on integrity. And I think this is something great. You know, sometimes you try to find some ways to fight corruption and stuff like that. Well, I would say to educate people and to make them say, you know what, you might have a lot of different position in your career, but you only have one integrity, and that you don't want to lose that.
Any other question? I think we're closing, so thank you very much, gentlemen. I think it's been enlightening. Thank you. Thank you. And is the